The 1950s were packed with glamour musicals, war epics, and widescreen spectacles, but not every film found success at the box office. Some flopped hard and vanished into obscurity. Yet decades later, these very failures became cult masterpieces. Rediscovered by film buff scholars and midnight movie lovers, they rewrote their own legacies. Here are 15 legendary bombs turned icons. Number 15, The Conqueror, 1956. It had John Wayne in the lead and Howard Hughes behind the production. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Cast as Genghis Khan in one of the most baffling examples of Hollywood whitewashing, Wayne was visibly uncomfortable in the role, and critics called it a disaster even at the time. The film's desert location in Utah near nuclear testing sites also turned tragic as multiple cast and crew members later developed cancer, including Wayne himself. Released with much fanfare, The Conqueror was roasted by critics and tanked at the box office, failing to recoup its extravagant budget. But time changed everything. Instead of disappearing, the film became infamous. Its bizarre casting, baffling line delivery, and somber radioactive legacy turned it into a morbid curiosity. Film students studied it. Midnight screenings emerged. Today, it is cherished by bad movie lovers who see it as a campy cautionary tale from the era of epic misfires. It's now part of cult cinema lore, not because of its greatness, but precisely because of how magnificently it failed. A legendary flop born again in cinematic infamy. Number 14, Alice in Wonderland, 1951. Walt Disney had dreams of adapting Lewis Carroll's surreal classic long before Snow White. But when Alice finally arrived on screen, critics called it cold, confusing, and overly dark. Audiences agreed. It underperformed massively, and Disney was reportedly embarrassed by the failure. The studio even pulled it from circulation. For years, the film was forgotten, a curio in the Disney vault. Then came the psychedelic 1960s. College campuses and counterculture youth rediscovered the trippy visuals and bizarre dream logic of Alice. Bootleg screenings and art house revivals made it a cult hit among those seeking alternative animation. Its hallucinatory colors, rebellious tone, and existential vibe spoke to a new generation. Disney slowly embraced its unlikely second life and re-released it with a new psychedelic marketing campaign. Today, it is hailed as one of the most daring and idiosyncratic films of Disney's early years, a box office flop that refused to stay buried. Number 13, Glenn or Glenda, 1953. When Ed Wood created Glenn or Glenda, he wasn't chasing box office success. He was telling his truth. The result was one of the most bizarre and unintentionally revealing films of the decade. Part confessional, part exploitation, and all confusion, it blended narration, stock footage, and surreal dream sequences to explore gender identity decades ahead of its time. On release, it was ridiculed. The film bombed badly and disappeared from most theaters within weeks. But Glenn or Glenda didn't die. It lingered in cult cinema circles, re-emerging through midnight showings and Ed Wood retrospectives. Its sincerity, awkwardness, and raw emotional core earned it respect from outsider artists and LGBTQ historians. It's now viewed as a deeply flawed but fascinating early example of queer cinema. From an embarrassment to an icon, Glenn or Glenda proved that even the strangest cinematic orphans can find a loving home in cult film history. Number 12, Plan 9 from Outer Space, 1959. You cannot talk about cult films without mentioning this notorious gem. Directed by Ed Wood, Plan 9. From Outer Space was a laughable attempt at sci-fi horror featuring cardboard sets, laughable dialogue, and stock footage of Bela Lugosi used after his death. It was a disaster even by low-budget standards. Audiences ignored it, critics destroyed it, and it quietly vanished from theaters. At the time, it was considered an embarrassing footnote in B-movie history. But time gave it power. In the 1980s, it was crowned the worst film ever made by critics and cult film fans, and that was exactly what made it legendary. Its earnestness, bad effects, and sincere failure turned it into the poster child for so bad it's good cinema. Midnight movie screenings packed with laughter gave it new life. Ed Wood went from punchline to icon. Today, Plan 9 is a pop culture staple studied, admired, and loved precisely because of its flaws. The bomb that became a blueprint for cult devotion. Number 11. The Asphalt Jungle, 1950. John Huston's gritty heist noir was a masterclass in tension and realism, but when it hit theaters, it didn't connect with mainstream audiences. Too bleak, too slow, and too morally ambiguous for the post-war crowd, The Asphalt Jungle quietly underperformed financially. Even the presence of rising star Marilyn Monroe in a minor role wasn't enough to save its initial run. It got modest praise, but nowhere near the acclaim it deserved. Yet over the years, the film found its audience. Critics rewatched it. Noir fans championed it. Directors like Quentin Tarantino cited it as essential. Its influence on future crime cinema became undeniable. The film's realistic depiction of a doomed heist would echo in works like Reservoir Dogs and The Killing. Today it stands as one of the most respected noirs of all time. A film that didn't dazzle the box office but rewrote the rules for the genre it helped define. A sleeper turned cult standard. Number 10. The Man from Laramie, 1955. James Stewart starred in this brooding western that ditched the usual tropes for something darker and more psychological. Directed by Anthony Mann, the film explored vengeance, betrayal, and isolation. But audiences weren't quite ready. It lacked the feel-good frontier justice that mainstream viewers expected. Despite strong performances and stark cinematography, the movie struggled at the box office and was largely overlooked in the crowded Western landscape of the mid-50s. Yet, something strange happened. As Westerns evolved into more complex, character-driven stories in the 60s and 70s, film historians began re-examining The Man from Laramie. Its influence became clear. It was raw ahead of its time and emotionally gripping. Critics like Pauline Kael later praised it as a forgotten masterpiece. Today, it is held up as one of Stewart's best Western roles and one of the finest adult Westerns of its decade. A forgotten writer returned to the trail of classic cinema. Number 9. Kiss Me Deadly, 1955. When Kiss Me Deadly hit theaters, it confused mainstream audiences and unnerved the censors. Its brutal violence, cold-blooded anti-hero, and surreal atomic age ending didn't fit the mold of traditional noir. Critics at the time dismissed it as perverse and nihilistic. Some even accused it of undermining American values. The Hays Code enforcers trimmed the original ending, softening its disturbing final image. Audiences stayed away, and the film fizzled out commercially. It was too dark too fast and too strange for the era. But beneath the surface, something was brewing. Film scholars in Europe began to take notice of the movie's radical visual style. The fragmented editing, the feverish pacing, and the apocalyptic undertones were seen not as flaws, but innovations. By the 1960s, it had become a touchstone of film noir revival. In the decades that followed, directors like Robert Aldrich were reappraised as visionaries. Kiss Me Deadly's once-banned explosive finale was restored and studied in film schools around the world. Its influence can be seen in everything from David Lynch's Mulholland Drive to Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction. What was once rejected as ugly and abrasive is now hailed as a masterpiece of existential dread, a cinematic ticking time bomb that finally exploded on its own terms. Number 8. Rio Bravo, 1959. Howard Hawks, John Wayne, and Dean Martin came together to create a Western unlike any other. Rio Bravo was deliberately slow, character-driven, and loaded with rich moments of silence and tension. But that wasn't what audiences wanted in 1959. Critics shrugged at its leisurely pace. It came out the same year as the epic Ben-Hur and paled in comparison at the box office. It wasn't a bomb in the traditional sense, but it underperformed relative to expectations and prestige. For a Wayne Hawks collaboration, that was a disappointment. Yet over time, Rio Bravo became a quiet giant. Filmmakers and cinephiles began dissecting its layers. Its influence on future directors is staggering. John Carpenter called it his favorite film and remade it in spirit with Assault on Precinct 13. Quentin Tarantino swears by its structure, its emotional beats, its use of confined space, and its slow-burn suspense helped shape a new wave of genre storytelling. Even French New Wave critics adored it, with Jean-Luc Godard naming it one of the greatest films of all time. What was once seen as a too-slow cowboy yarn became one of the most studied and revered westerns in cinema history. From box office underdog to revered blueprint, Rio Bravo's cult status was earned through quiet defiance. Number 7. The Night of the Hunter, 1955. Charles Laughton only directed one film in his career, and at first it looked like a colossal failure. The Night of the Hunter was a gothic southern nightmare filled with expressionistic lighting, haunting child performances, and a terrifying villain in Robert Mitchum's preacher with love and hate tattooed on his knuckles. But in 1955, audiences didn't know what to make of it. Critics called it too weird and too theatrical. The movie bombed. Laughton never directed again. It was buried quickly and forgotten by many. But in the shadows, the legend grew. Film historians rediscovered it in the 1970s. They were stunned. The poetic cinematography, the fairy tale horror, and the duality of good and evil were unlike anything else from the era. Directors like Martin Scorsese and David Lynch cited it as formative. Roger Ebert called it one of the greatest of all American films. The film's daring visual style, with silhouettes, shadows, and dreamlike river sequences, became the language of modern psychological thrillers. Once discarded as a misfire, The Night of the Hunter is now preserved in the National Film Registry and revered as an artistic triumph. It may have ruined Laughton's directing career, but it inspired generations to dream darker and dig deeper. Number 6. Paths of Glory, 1957. Stanley Kubrick's Paths of Glory was a film with fire in its veins and ice in its delivery. Set during World War I, it told the story of French soldiers executed for cowardice after a failed assault. Kirk Douglas gave one of his most searing performances as the officer fighting the injustice. But in 1957, the film didn't connect. France banned it outright for years, calling it unpatriotic. Other European countries followed suit. American audiences didn't flock to see it either. The film didn't earn back its modest budget and was mostly seen as an intellectual misfire. Yet time has transformed it into one of the greatest anti-war films ever made. Kubrick's stark black-and-white visuals, his relentless tracking shots, and his haunting courtroom drama format became cinematic legend. As the director's reputation grew, so did the status of Paths of Glory. Critics praised its moral clarity and emotional devastation. Film scholars analyzed its precision and existentialism. Directors like Steven Spielberg and Sam Mendes cite it as a touchstone for war storytelling. Today it is held up as one of Kubrick's finest works, a masterpiece that dared to condemn the machinery of war with brutal honesty. What the world once rejected it now teaches in film schools, a silent bombshell that detonated years after impact. Number 5. The Man with the Golden Arm, 1955. Before the rating system, before gritty realism became fashionable, Otto Preminger unleashed The Man with the Golden Arm. Frank Sinatra played a jazz drummer battling heroin addiction and gave what many consider the performance of his career. But the film shocked audiences. It was one of the first American movies to depict drug use with raw, unfiltered intensity. The production code refused to approve it. Many theaters refused to show it. Despite Sinatra's star power, it struggled at the box office and was labeled controversial rather than courageous. But that controversy would become its strength. Over the next 2 decades, it was hailed as a trailblazer, Its unflinching look at addiction helped pave the way for films like Requiem for a Dream and Trainspotting. Sinatra's performance earned new praise, and the film's jazz score by Elmer Bernstein was recognized as revolutionary. Film historians see it as a turning point, the moment when Hollywood dared to lift the curtain on taboo subjects. It became a cult hit among recovering addicts, musicians, and cinephiles alike. A bomb on arrival, but a landmark in legacy, The Man with the Golden Arm turned a scandal into a standard. Number 4, The Big Combo, 1955. The Big Combo was noir with a vengeance. Bleak, brutal, and bathed in shadow, it was too intense for mainstream audiences of its time. Directed by Joseph H. Lewis and shot by legendary cinematographer John Alton, the film featured torture scenes, sexual innuendo, and a villain who oozed menace. Critics were divided, the censors were nervous, audiences mostly stayed away. It made little impact on release, vanishing into the thick fog of post-war crime dramas. But it didn't stay lost. As the noir revival exploded in the 1970s and 1980s, critics and scholars rediscovered The Big Combo and were stunned. Its visuals were pure chiaroscuro brilliance, its themes were daring, and its editing razor-sharp. Quentin Tarantino called it a visual masterpiece. Film noir enthusiasts adopted it as a hidden treasure. The ending, a silhouette chase in a hangar filled with fog, became one of the genre's most iconic images. From forgotten B-movie to noir royalty, The Big Combo carved out its legend in shadows. It didn't explode in theaters, but it lit a fuse that's still burning. Number 3. Vertigo, 1958. It's almost unthinkable today, but when Alfred Hitchcock released Vertigo, it was considered a failure. Critics thought it was too slow, too confusing, and too bleak. Audiences didn't show up in the numbers expected for a Hitchcock thriller, and it ended up being one of the director's biggest financial disappointments. Even Hitchcock distanced himself from it. The film sat in obscurity for decades, out of circulation and largely forgotten, except by a small group of devoted admirers. But something changed. In the 1980s, Vertigo returned to theaters in a restored print, and critics were stunned. The dreamlike cinematography, the psychological unraveling of James Stewart's character, and Bernard Herrmann's hypnotic score were suddenly recognized as genius. It wasn't just another Hitchcock mystery. It was an obsession on film, a study of desire, death, and the illusion of control. In 2012, Sight and Sound's critics' poll declared it the greatest film of all time, dethroning Citizen Kane. From box office disappointment to cinema's crowning jewel, Vertigo became the ultimate cult ascension, a film that climbed its own spiral staircase to immortality. Number 2. The Blob, 1958. The Blob oozed into theaters as a goofy drive-in monster movie with a then-unknown Steve McQueen in the lead. Critics didn't take it seriously. It was dismissed as juvenile sci-fi pulp, and its theatrical performance was modest. It made back its budget, but did not cause much of a stir beyond the teenage matinee crowd. It wasn't sophisticated enough for the mainstream, and not quite outrageous enough to become an instant hit. But The Blob had staying power. As horror fans grew nostalgic for the atomic age creature features, The Blob found new life. Midnight movie screenings, TV syndication, and ironic appreciation turned it into a cult icon. Its catchy title song, kitschy effects, and surprisingly tense pacing earned it legions of retro horror fans. It was remade in the 1980s and even got its own annual festival in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, where it was filmed. What began as a rubbery joke became a slippery legend. The Blob may not have exploded at the box office, but it swallowed pop culture whole. Number 1. Citizen Kane, 1941. Though released in the early 1940s, Citizen Kane was buried for much of the 1950s and only found true cult status in that decade. Orson Welles' magnum opus was a critical success in 1941, but box office sabotage by William Randolph Hearst's media empire nearly destroyed it. It was nominated for multiple Oscars, but only won one, and then it vanished from theaters. In the 1950s, it was revived by scholars, students, and film societies, rediscovering its revolutionary camera work structure and themes of power and loneliness. Citizen Kane became a film whispered about in university screenings and passed along like a secret message. Film schools enshrined it. Directors from Spielberg to Scorsese to Kubrick declared it the standard of cinematic genius. What was once politically buried and commercially strangled became the ultimate example of how box office bombs can become untouchable icons. It may have failed in its own time, but Citizen Kane is the grandfather of all cult masterpieces and a beacon for those who believe cinema can be both art and rebellion. The box office doesn't always decide a film's fate. These 15 bombs defied rejection and found glory through devotion, revival, and time. What once flopped now flourishes in cult circles and critical canons. Which one surprised you the most? Like and subscribe for more cinematic resurrection stories from the vault.